Excellent. So here we have George Dvorskry again, and we've just finished an interview on media performance and anti-aging. Now we're moving on to the topic of the conference coming up later on in the year in December. I think I forget what's the date.
December 6th to 8th, and it's going to be at Yale University, which is in New Haven, Connecticut.
That's right. The Personhood Beyond the Human Conference, and the URL is nonhumanrights.net. I've done some other interviews, such as with James Hughes about this subject, so I look at those as well. But there's George Dvorskry has been part of the IEEE program, the Non-Human Animal Personhood program. So I think that's worth discussing. George, you're going to be talking at this conference, and also you're one of the organisers. Do you want to talk about the Personhood Beyond the Human conference?
Yeah, I'll just briefly tell you how it came about. I did start this program at the IEET. It's called the Rights of the Non-Human Persons Program.
Yes,
And
that's
just to kind
right.
of quickly fill your audience in on what we're talking about there, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like, which is this idea that humans don't have a monopoly on this thing that is the person. And what we mean by the person is really an agent or a being in this world that's deserving of a different kind of set of, I guess, considerations and even legal protections, and it's largely based on the kinds of capacities that they have. So we're starting to think somewhat small, looking at a very select group of candidate species. The first animal that was kind of brought to my attention was by virtue of Peter Singer, and his Great Ape project was, it kind of rocked my world when he was suggesting that we need to give great apes some rights that are
Yeah.
and protections that are very similar to the kinds that we would see in afforded to humans. And we're not talking about a lot of what I call positive rights, but they're more negative rights. What we mean by that is the right to not be experimented upon, so more like protective rights. So the right to not be experimented upon, the rights to not be tortured or confined against their will, even to be murdered, those sorts of things, to perform at circuses or at aquatic theme parks, those sorts of things. So I started to think that Peter Singer was definitely on the right track, but I think he was thinking perhaps, or focusing rather too much on just one particular set of animals, because I think that when it comes down to the capacities of other animals, I think they're comparable to comparable, but also the so-called the high functioning or the higher animals sort of thing. So we've got also in consideration here are dolphins and whales, so all the cetaceans, and we've got elephants as well. And so I set up the program at the IET, where we were advocating for this and sort of trying to just raise awareness. And then I kind of thought that the time was right. The word was getting out enough that we should probably hold a formal conference on the matter. And I know that there have been other conferences where they've discussed it, but I don't think there's been a conference today where it's been dedicated to the entire to that entire subject matter. And so yeah, we managed to find some partners. So we have a related organization run by Stephen Wise with a very similar name. It's the Rights of the Non-Human Persons Program. But Stephen, as sponsors, they're very sympathetic to what we're doing. What they're doing, whereas we tend more towards the philosophical and towards even a bit to the scientific. And even just in terms of a public policy group, which was what we are, they're actually working on the kind of legal mechanisms required to see certain candidate species be given person equivalent rights in the United States. And as a matter of fact, in the next couple of weeks or months, they are going to announce the first plaintiff in their case. No one knows who it's going to be. I think they said it was going to be a chimpanzee, some kind of a great ape. That's probably in captivity somewhere in the United States. Don't know what state it's going to be in, but they're going to just spring this on somebody, that they're going to fight for this particular ape's personhood rights, so that they will have to basically stop what they're doing for this, and they're going to hope to create an incredible precedent by virtue of doing this. So you can see why this is a group that we're very sympathetic to, and why they're definitely welcome to join us at our conference. So and we're also going to have Peter Singer keynote,
Yeah, I was going to
which is
suggest.
fantastic. Yeah, actually, believe it or not, it'll be my first time ever meeting Peter Singer, so that's
Really?
going to go well. And again, just for your audience,
Well, he's
just,
an Australian, and I've never met him. Another
oh,
Australian.
okay,
God.
okay. Well, I think he's out of Princeton, but yeah, he's like the founder of the modern human rights movement and modern animal rights movement. So yeah, that'll be great to have him there. And it's just so fitting to have him be our keynote speaker.
Absolutely.
And we'll have where we also tend to get a bit more conceptual. is we're not just talking about animal rights. We're also thinking ahead to the future. And this is another thing that I thought that the IEET was a vehicle for me as well, that I could start to talk about the potential rights for machine consciousness and machine based intelligence. And to already look ahead and wonder, like, could we ever get to the point where we will have to respect a conscious machine as being a person, and so what form would that take, and what kinds of rights would they need, and so forth. So we get very speculative, but also I think preemptive in terms of that kind of speculation. So I'm just going to call up the schedule right now to give you an idea. Like, we have, for example, I'm sure many of your viewers are familiar with the work of Martine Rothblatt.
Yes.
And she's going to be speaking about the personhood of cyber consciousness.
Right.
We have also, for example, we're going to have Samir Chopra from Brooklyn College speak about personhood for artificial agents and what it teaches us about animal rights. Linda McDonald Glenn, bioethicist, I think she works out of Vermont. She'll be speaking about
I know her.
Yeah, human-machine hybrids and personhood. So we're not just going to be talking about, like, what is it about a dolphin's intelligence that makes us want to consider it, to be a person, and so on. We're also very much tied into the futurism. So I think that we're going to try to cover all of our bases during this weekend. So that's, anyways, my long response to your question.
Well, James Hughes is going to be talking too. What's he talking about?
Yeah, 1 second. James is going to be speaking about building a political strategy to secure personhood rights, which is absolutely in his wheelhouse. I can't wait to hear what he has to say. Mm-hmm. I'll be speaking about the social, legal, and political consequences of non-human animal personhood. Mm-hmm. So I'm already going to be talking about, okay, what happens when we succeed? What happens when we're successful? When we start to give these animals the kinds of considerations and protections that we're talking about. And so, for example, does that mean we're going to shut down all the zoos, and we're going to I shouldn't say shut down zoos and shut down aquatic theme parks, but we're not going to allow certain animals to be at those particular venues. So no more elephants, for example, at zoos. Definitely no more dolphins and orca whales performing at aquatic theme parks. So we'll have to work to phase them out. But at the same time, now we're going to have to, okay, so what do we do with these particular creatures? Or similarly, what do we do about all the medical testing on chimps around the world, of which there's still a substantial number of that happening? I know that in the United States, for example, the government labs have stopped testing on chimps, and they're relocating them into sanctuaries. But private institutions are still testing on chimps. So if these laws should pass, what are going to happen to all those chimps? So we have to get into kind of rehabilitative mindset, thinking about creating sanctuaries. There's even people, for example, in Europe already thinking about how to treat them for the psychological torments that they've gone through. And believe it or not, they've found that SSRIs, the kind of standard stuff that we humans would take for similar kinds of depressive conditions, is actually working on the great apes, which is also revealing unto itself, because it shows how, and I hate to say this because at the risk of being human-centric, but it does point to the fact that they have very similar emotional states to our own. If we're treating them with antidepressants that work for us and that works for them, that really does show, we're talking about similar kinds of emotive responses. So it further justifies this idea that we shouldn't be keeping them in cages and testing them in labs and these sorts of things. So this is largely what my talk will be about. But even things like, okay, what happens when a fisherman captures and kills a dolphin in his net by accident? Is that reckless endangerment? Is it manslaughter? Or how do you what's going to happen in those sorts of situations? So what I want to do is show that we're also at the same time heading into some very tricky territory, unprecedented territory, and we have to be ready for all these kinds of contingencies. Another one, for example, back to the chimps. Right now, as it stands, the NIH and government labs in the United States, even though they let all the chimps free from their labs and put them into sanctuaries, they made very clear in the paperwork that they reserve the right to bring back a select group of chimps in an emergency. Meaning, let's say, Adam, for example, there's a pandemic breaks out, and we need to start to work on a vaccine or some kind of a retrovirus of some sort to combat it. They will reserve the right to take those chimps back and start to experiment on them once again. So in other words, give them the virus, test the vaccines on them, or whatever, what other kinds of medicines on them. So, but if we have pass laws that protect animals from that, would they still be subject to these sorts of recalls? And would the Supreme Court be brazen enough to uphold their rights, given, let's say, like a viral catastrophe? So these are also tricky areas that we're going to have to kind of consider. Should we? And I shouldn't say should. If we, I'm quite convinced that we will see personhood type protections afforded to these animals in short order. It'll be a struggle. It'll take a while, but I certainly see it's something happening within the next several decades for sure.
Sure, and achieving legal precedent is a very difficult thing. Especially, I can imagine it would be really hard for doing that for animals and machine intelligence, which we haven't really got a lot of. We've got nothing for machine intelligence or machine conscious or machine sentience.
And that scares the crap out of me because I think that the potential for harm. Anders Sandberg gave a fantastic talk. He's the futurist from Sweden. I think is currently at Oxford.
He's at Future of Humanity Institute. Yep.
Yeah, gave a fantastic talk. He and I are very much on the same wavelength about this. About there's going to come a point in time when some computer scientist is working in his lab, and what used to be either a very sophisticated piece of script or a kind of emulation of a primitive or basic brain has that spark of awareness, intelligence, even a bit of self-reflexivity, the ability to even process its environment, that because we're dealing now with something that's embedded within a machine, I think the potential for harm is very substantial. So he's already setting up some guidelines, setting up even some prescriptions for how to deal with that, and I think he's one of the few people on the planet that are actually thinking along these lines. So these are baby steps right now, but definitely that's part of the conversation when it comes to all of this. And there's definitely huge risks involved in terms of the potential to exact harms on these digital agents.
And I mean, like it's easier to sort of couch these ethics when we can sort of I guess relate directly to other humans. We apply these sort of rights and ethics to humans. But another speaker at the conference, what's this called? Wendell Wallach has also written a book called Moral Machines. So yeah, I think you've got some amazing lineup here. David Brin is coming to speak, and he wrote extensively on like animal rights. He's got a lot of books that talk about the sentience in dolphins and other animals. So I think it's going to be a kick-ass conference.
It's exciting to have David Brin there in particular because he's one of the guys that has talked about animal uplift, for example, which has been influential in my thinking. So in terms of like what my talk, in terms of the consequences, for example, does personhood designation infer the imperative to uplift animals? And what I mean by uplift, of course, is to endow their capacities in certain direction. It doesn't necessarily mean to humanize them. A lot of people think that that's what uplift means, is to make them more human, give them human type intelligence. I think that's a mistake. I think obviously we need to work, if we're going to start to uplift animals, we need to figure out ways to modify and augment their latent capacities in a way that, let's say, work in the best interest of dolphin, the dolphin future, dolphin personhood, dolphin, kind of a post-dolphin modality, how that might work.
Yeah, bit of a dilemma there.
It's a dilemma because another thing that I get a lot of heat about, and it's definitely worth discussing, is the kind of imposition this places upon these animals, because they're currently not in a position to be political at all. They're not in a position. They don't have the capacity to organize themselves in any kind of a way that's human-like. But if you were to give them the capacity to do so, by virtue of that, you force them to become political. You force them to now take part in the broader politic that is, let's say, of all persons, all modified persons. And is that something that was in their best interest? There's a great Futurama episode where there's a kind of highly intelligent monkey. I think it's a monkey.
Yes, that's right.
Goes to university and he becomes miserable because he has to work so hard. He'd rather be just a simple monkey in the jungle eating bananas and being silly and all that.
Right.
So it was an excellent episode that kind of teased the various ideas apart about is ignorance bliss, or is it in our best interest to give these animals the kinds of capacities such that they can be more self-determinate, both in terms of the individuals and in terms of their the broader species or society altogether. I realize it's highly speculative stuff, but these are, again, right now I'm just thinking ahead.
Yeah,
Or
Rousseau.
trying to
It's
anyways.
it's very the tension between this Rousseau esque sort of ideal where living close to nature is what we're really intended to do, and maybe we can also extend that to animals, but taking away the choice of the animals, like or making the choice to put them in like a put them in a headspace where they can be political about their wants will actually probably change their wants. So that's an interesting
Absolutely.
one. But David Pearce, I'm sure you're aware of his hedonistic imperative, the abolitionists project. This is probably far future, much more far future, but it's an interesting discussion that he brings up. Should we be developing sanctuaries to that stop, like for instance, lions preying on cattle, and have like the sheep lie down with the lions, so to speak, and reducing suffering, regardless, regardless of how different it may be from the current nature, because nature may be very cruel and unkind. I think they did a study in Yellowstone National Park where they introduced wolves, and suddenly the animals or the cattle, or I think they were bison or something, who were once sort of more healthy and free and would just graze on on very nutrient-rich pastures, then got really scared, and they hid in the woods and grazed on less nutrient-enriched foods so that they could hide from the wolves. And all the calves were at their parents' legs all the time, and they seemed very unhappy. So yeah, maybe redesigning the whole sort of ecosystem. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that line
Yeah,
of thinking?
I think it's right of you to bring that up in the context of the discussion. I mean, David Pierce is definitely he's taking the long view here,
Yes,
longer view
certainly
than,
is. Yeah.
what we're doing by virtue of even discussing, like, certainly in discussion of personhood and even for the potential for uplift.
Mm.
But it's a very challenging argument, and it's one that I've thought about long and hard, and it's one that I'm even somewhat partial to. And it also kind of, I think, speaks much to my Buddhist inclination as well, which
Mm.
is working towards the alleviation of suffering in all sentient creatures. And I think it's a long view that's very admirable, and maybe one we should very seriously consider.
Mm.
And which is, are we obligated morally to eliminate suffering in the animal kingdom? And like your excellent example was that we see it around us constantly, that the state of nature is barbaric, it's cruel, it's filled with misery and suffering, and both on a physical level, but especially at an emotional level for these
Mm.
animals. And you know, one of the arguments that I've made is that why should we assume for one moment that humans are the only ones that can benefit from the kinds of technologies that can separate us from the laws of nature or separate us from even evolutionary processes? Why would we assume that we wouldn't want to do the same to all of the animals in our environment? And how we can actually do that is it's obviously an open question. How can we create an ecology that's still sustainable, that's still verdant, that's still going to create a lush planet where we've at the same time where we're trying to pull back as much as possible on these kinds of predatory arrangements, where definitely one animal lives for the expense of the other, and so on. Now
Mm.
that's a trickier question,
Oh
one that
yes.
might be addressed by obviously the environmentalists and ecologists of the future. I'm sure obviously come up with some models and other kinds of ideas for how that could work. But that details aside, I think the point that Pierce makes is a valid one, and one, like I said, that's a challenging one that we certainly do need to consider, which is, we probably should be more. We should be thinking more along the lines of how do we reduce the amount of suffering that's happening out there in the natural world.
Definitely, it's a very interesting thing. Although I don't think the conference will be covering David Pearce's abolitionist project in detail. I think it's more about like what we can do short term and how we can
Yeah.
make practical changes to laws and to politics today. to sort of, I guess, increase the likelihood, perhaps, of David's view in the long term, or something completely different. So, yeah, well, I'm looking forward to this conference. So it's going to have a whole heap of people, and it goes for 2 full days. Are there any like related associated events on around the conference
I don't
that
think
would be
so. I
worth?
mean, just to break it down, I mean, on the Friday night, we're just going to have Peter Singer's keynote.
Yep.
And then on the Saturday, we're going to be definitely focusing in on a lot of the science behind animal personhood. So we're not just, obviously, not just going to be making philosophical claims and even conjectures about, the capacities of these animals. I think what's exciting about this particular time in history is that we can actually now peer into the brain and point to this part there and say, you see that? That's actually very similar to what we've got in our brains that give us this emotional, spectrum and this spark of conscious awareness there. So it works just like ours. So we can now move from purely behavioralist models to actual neuroscientific, cognitive models to kind of to prove that these animals have those sorts of capacities. Then to also now show, okay, what kinds of capacities are we talking about? So very standard one, for example, when it comes to personhood is the mirror test. So we know that elephants, for example, recognize themselves in a mirror. Dolphins absolutely recognize themselves in a mirror, and so do all of the great apes. And we take that for granted. You take a dog, you put a dog in front of the mirror, no idea. It absolutely thinks it's another dog. So similarly, we're also looking at kinds of other traits that we're looking for that would be indicative of personhood would be the theory of other mind. So in other words, a kind of empathy. Animals that understand that there are other animals in their environment that have their thoughts and have their, they respond to their, they'll have their own emotional responses and so on.
Yeah, sure.
Other personhood criteria include some maybe perhaps more controversially, but even a range of intelligence, like an IQ range, so that it falls below a certain threshold, but doesn't count. Again, I'm not necessarily advocating for or against that particular standpoint. I'm just saying that that's out there in terms of the criteria, some people would say is valid criteria. And another big one is the ability to project oneself into the future, so you understand kind of consequences, that if I do this and this it's going to happen to me. Even a sense of oneself over the past, of a sense of one's history, that there's a narrative over time of who I am, the individual. So these are a bit trickier to prove in animals, but we'll get there. And both through crafty scientists, but also looking at the brain mechanisms to see that they actually have these capacities. And anyway, so that's for example, we're gonna have Lori. Excitingly, we're gonna have Lori Marino at the conference, and she's going to give a couple of talks both on the Saturday and the Sunday. Okay. And she works with Stephen Wise's group there at which are the legal people that I was talking about. Mm-hmm. She's their science advisor, and she's going to be speaking about the science of the Non-Human Rights Project. Sure. And her specialty is in marine biology and in dolphin intelligence in particular. So if you want to hear somebody really know their stuff when it comes to what dolphins are capable of, how sophisticated they are, how maybe perhaps in certain cognitive domains they actually may be superior to humans. Speaking of which, by the way, I'm sure many of your viewers know that even some great apes have greater cognitive capacities than humans. Like, we're not the smartest in every one of brain tasks. For example, Japanese research shows that certain chimps, I believe, they are much better at memorization tasks than university level students. Wow. by a margin. So they can memorize things much more quickly, retain that in that short-term memory, and then recall it much better than humans. So again, it's kind of maybe human arrogance assumes that we're better at animals at everything when it comes to brain-specific activities, but that's not necessarily the case. And I can almost assure you that virtually every animal is going to have something that's both more and, let's say, less in terms of what humans are capable of. So yeah, Lori Marino will be speaking about this stuff on this Saturday, which has me very excited. And she'll be also giving a talk on the second day as well. We've got other talks that we've got for example, on patenting human organisms, discussion of the whole. You mentioned Wendell Wallach. He'll be talking about animal, human, and corporation robots, the appropriating personhood for different purposes. So his particular concern is, again, weaponizing of robotics and the whole moral machine idea. So that's going to be. It'd be interesting to see how he teases that into the discussion. I think his will be more of a cautionary tale to make sure that who you're calling a person is actually a person and not just some kind of legal trick to like call it the corporate personhood trick to protect certain institutions that way. So,
Right.
which is another thing that's important for me to bear this out in case somebody might misunderstand. We're absolutely not talking about corporate personhood. That's definitely not what we're talking about. That's those legal tricks, legal necessities, if you will, to kind of create rights around certain I guess social bodies.
There's a lot of people here who I know. Steve Fuller also. I did a series of interviews with him when I was in the UK, so he's coming and speaking. Wow.
Excellent.
So, sorry, I interrupted you.
Right.
You were going to say something about
legal
entities?
You might have a more up-to-date version of the schedule than I do then.
I just saw it online.
This is changing. Excellent.
Yeah, he's quite eloquent actually. He was really good when I interviewed him. So yeah, check out that interview on my YouTube channel. Everybody who's listening. One of the interesting experiments we're talking about behaviorism is you have like people put two monkeys in an environment, and in one test there was an alpha male, and then and in the same sort of zone there was like a monkey that was lower down on the hierarchy of monkeys. And so they put bananas there so that they could see, so both the alpha male and the sort of I guess lower down the ranking male could see the bananas. The alpha male wasn't hungry, the lower ranking monkey was hungry, but the lower ranking monkey wouldn't go and eat the bananas because it thought that it might have to fend off fend off like the alpha male, which wouldn't be good because it was a big monkey. And so really it was hypothesized that it required a theory of mind, a real theory of mind, so it would then determine what's going on in that monkey's head, because the next experiment was the bananas were putting in a place where the alpha male couldn't see them. Then the lower ranking monkey went and took the bananas and ate them. Okay, because he thought, well, the lower ranking, the alpha male can't see me. I can just go and eat the bananas. Nobody's watching, so there's no minds trying to really watch me. I can get away with this, right?
Yeah,
so
I
it's
love
interesting.
I love studies like that because it really points to exactly what we're talking about. Is how do you prove that these animals have these capacities that we suspect that they have, and these are very clever experiments. And I always love hearing when scientists come up with these sorts of tasks and to show, hey, look, this absolutely explains what we're suspecting. I also like it. You reminded me as well. Another objection that we get to animal personhood is the idea that you can't possibly endow an animal with this kind of special designation if it can't be accountable for its actions. That they say, look, we humans, we understand the difference between right and wrong. We understand that there can be some real consequences to our actions, particularly if they're negative actions. And but an animal is oblivious to this. That an animal will continue to brutalize maybe its prey, even each other. And you do see that. I mean,
yeah, I've seen orcas play with seals, right? Yeah.
Yeah, this sort of thing. And so by virtue of that, we can't possibly protect them in this sort of way or give them that designation. My problem with that is we have the same. I don't think that's necessarily a criteria for denial. It's not like a deal breaker. And excuse me. And maybe I'll point to an example. For example, how we. All humans, for example, are granted personhood, yet we know that many humans aren't capable of being responsible for their actions. So we don't strip them of their of their status as a result. And I'm talking, of course, perhaps maybe criminally insane people, but even let's say somebody with a severe developmental disorder, we would never say, oh, that's not a person. No, we actually, if anything, we need to look out for their best interests, look to protect them, and look to protect others from them as well at the same time. So that is another conversation that does tend to come up from time to time during these kinds of conversations, but one that I think definitely doesn't necessarily hold its weight.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. Yeah, there are a lot of objections. Have you got any articles that you can point us to that cover some of these objections?
Absolutely, the objections, not so much, but I can certainly point you to some related articles along the whole personhood. So let me just call up here.
You've been right into this for a long time. I mean, your
I
original
have,
web blog was Sentient Developments. Is that correct?
yeah, and
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
still around. I do update it from time to time, certainly
yeah,
not as
yeah.
much as I used to.
Mm.
So I'm just going to send you some links. For example, I think this case where Stephen Wise, where they're going to name a captive chimp as a plaintiff in what's going to be an historic case. I'd love to see. I'd love to see that. Another thing I would recommend is there was a recent documentary called Blackfish,
Ah,
which is about the captivity of an orca whale named Tilikum, which is a 12,000-pound orca whale that's been involved in the deaths of 3 individuals, and it kind of shows the consequences of keeping whales in captivity, the effects it has on their psyches, and the ways in which these animals are even starting to lash out. So again, we're seeing this like a very antisocial behavior, very dangerous behavior, but it shows that it's because of the way they're being treated. They are literally lashing out, kind of fighting for their lives, kind of just being nasty because of the ways that they're being treated.
hmm.
And I also have a kind of primer at Ionine, an article entitled simply "When Does an Animal Count as a Person?" And if we go through the different arguments, both for and against it, I talked to Laurie Marino, I talked to philosopher John Shook, and we go into all the various discussions as well. There's one more I'm going to send you, Adam, as well. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness came out back in August of last year.
Oh, wow. That could be interesting.
And basically, it was an international group of prominent scientists, and they signed this Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, in which they proclaimed this idea that animals are conscious and aware to the degree that humans are. Again, let's not confuse intelligence, even emotional spectrum, with consciousness. The consciousness, of course, being that awareness of the environment, the instantiation of qualia and subjectivity. So they included what was astounding about the declaration. What was astounding was how long it took them to get their act together to sign this, because scientists have had their heads in the sand about this for forever. But what was at the very least a relief about the declaration was that they included all animals, or virtually all animals. So that included all mammals, birds, even the octopus, and basically making the door wide open to show that we can't ignore these sorts of possibilities. So that was very exciting for that to finally happen last year. So in other words, a lot of ivory tower types are starting to kind of get their head out of the sand and realize that it's okay to talk about animal consciousness outside of the human experience, which, like I said, is a long time coming. So we're definitely living through kinds of a bit of a sea change when it comes to our appreciation of animal intelligence, animal behavior, and of course animal consciousness and what they're experiencing as well.
Oh, look, it's certainly a very interesting time to be alive, to see these sorts of developments. Perhaps if I were living 200 years ago, these sorts of things wouldn't have really crossed my mind. But it's, now I'm a bit of a techno enthusiast, and a lot of my friends are, and I'm involved in a larger community of like techno progressives and transhumanists and all that. But this conference really isn't just won't be just for techno enthusiasts. I mean, it seems to bridge a lot of areas together: animal rights activists, environmentalists, ethicists, bioethicists. It seems as though it's going to be a really interesting mix of people.
Yeah. Thank you for saying so, and that's exactly the kind of conference that I was hoping we could put together. That one that would appeal as much to those on the animal rights and animal welfare side of things as much as to those that would consider themselves progressives, techno-progressives, but even those looking into deep future issues as well. I mean, sure, we talked about the potential for machine consciousness and looking out for their potential personhood rights, but one of the reasons why I even got into this in the first place was the discussion of how will posthumans, how will whatever version of us comes afterwards, or versions, as I'm sure it's going to be kind of a multiplicity of forms. How will they treat humans? And because isn't this a big fear? Like, what will posthumans? Will they even acknowledge us? Will they just destroy us? Will they be ambivalent toward us? Will they exterminate us? So I got thinking, like, how can we possibly, maybe preemptively, secure our what will be humans in a post-human world? Because not everybody's going to be. There's always going to be humans. You're always going to have people that are going to be
Hmm.
that they're going to hold out or
Yeah,
refuse or not have
just
access.
biological only,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
whatever, and that's all good. I mean,
Hmm.
people don't want to engage in enhancement technologies. That's their prerogative.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean, obviously, that they therefore deserve to be persecuted and forgotten in the dustbin of history. So I got thinking, well, we actually have these kinds of opportunities today to kind of create analogies, and I realized, well, we as humans are already neglecting our responsibilities when it comes to protecting highly sapient entities in our immediate environment. You know, with the way we disrespect and abuse whales and cetaceans and great apes is maybe a potential example of the kinds of troubles we'll get into if we don't deal with this in the here and now. Because then we'll be subject to maybe similar kinds of persecutions in the future when there are much higher sapient or more highly intelligent entities in control of the planet. And so I thought, look, if you can't wrap your head around non-human animal personhood, well, then you're going to run the risk of not being able to wrap your head around whatever version of human 2.0 comes around and starts treating us in that sort of nefarious and neglectful sort of a way. So to me, it's part of it. It's absolutely part of a broader discussion about the protection, highly sapient, or not even highly sapient, but definitely the protection of those sorts of animals that are deserving of these protections and need to have some kind of legal mechanisms in place to ensure that they don't get abused and neglected and all that sort of stuff.
Excellent.
Yeah.
On a more personal note, you've got a bit of a Buddhist background, similar like James Hughes does too. And I guess this is one of the early philosophies which really considered, I guess, the mind states of animals as well as humans or just entities. Um, I'm just wondering, like, since you did have a background in Buddhism, or you were partial to Buddhist philosophy, I assume in some ways you still are. How
Mhm.
did that affect your thinking? How do you think that contributed to your thinking on this animal rights and non-human personhood topics today?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how we've got a philosophy that's, centuries and centuries old and like millennia old, um, just intuitively picked up on the fact that animals are, sentient and they're deserving of, moral consideration.
I think a lot of
Just,
people do,
just,
yeah.
yeah, just by sheer, intuition, if you will, and carrying that ethic, that morality with them forward. And yeah, for me, picking up on that, I came across Buddhism and transhumanism at roughly the same time, which is now about 10, 12 years ago or so.
Okay.
And it's so beautifully, they both beautifully fused, in and out of each other in ways that I thought were very compatible. I never saw them as being, at odds with each other. And if anything, it steered my I mean, I've got many interests as a futurist and a futurologist, but by virtue even of my blog's name is Sentient Developments. I was very much interested in cognition, in neuroscience, and what it means to be, a sapient agent in this universe. And I just couldn't help but, keep tying back Buddhist morality into all of it in terms of how we need to treat each other, how we need to look at ourselves. One of the things I really like about Buddhism is that it's not merely a prescription for looking out for the others. Buddhism first and foremost says you got to look out for number one. That until this isn't working properly, until you haven't trained this thing properly, and work to alleviate your own suffering, even to kind of get your own perspective on what's causing your own distress. How can you possibly help others? But that being said, that is also part of the your mission, if you will, or your purpose in this universe is to not just look out for number one, but by virtue of that, you've got to look out for everybody else, and that's not just humans. There's no need to be anthropocentric about it, and in fact, I mean, it was by virtue of my dabblings into Buddhism that I became this kind of so-called non-anthropocentric personhood bioethicist, which is this idea that you should be anthropocentric in your discussions of ethics and sentient awareness and all that. So that's kind of how it all intermingled and congealed into what it is my broader perspective on all these things.
And so, what people may not know is that you've been probably one of the most prolific, um, techno progressive, long term thinking, ethical, transhuman sort of voices out there in the community for quite some time, and now even more so at IO9. It seems like I've seen some things that most transhumanists would really agree with come on one of the most prolific websites out there on science and technology.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I mean,
it's
I spent the first yeah. I mean, I've been blogging at Sentient Developments for 10 years, and I
yes,
quite literally got hired by IO9 on the same week I celebrated my 10th anniversary as a
good
blogger.
stuff. Yeah.
And it was a very interesting experience because I went from speaking to a very niche community. I mean, for a
Mm.
decade, I've been writing to the community that you're so very well, entrenched in right now. When you're in it, kind of from the inside, it seems like a large community. But
Mm.
then when you start to write for a major media publication like IO9,
Mm-hmm.
which is run by Gawker Media,
Mm-hmm.
you realize that you have to you're not getting the you're now getting such a broad audience that these are ideas they've never heard of before. Like when you
Yeah.
start talking about like what we were talking about today, let's say some of David Pearce's ideas for the I wrote very early on. I wrote an article about the elimination of pain
Mm.
amongst for like should we eliminate the human capacity for pain, which is another kind of an idea that David Pearce brings forward. You can like the negativity that you receive. From those who are not immersed in these ideas and don't necessarily think in progressive terms or even in philosophical terms about these things, there's very often a kind of very strange reaction that you get. So for the first half a year or so of writing for I9, I had to change. I don't feel like I've changed my subject matter at all. I'm very proud of the fact that I still write the same things I would write for Sentient Developments. But what I've changed perhaps is the approach towards addressing these ideas, how to present them in a way that's a bit more palatable, that's even more conducive towards conversation and critical discourse. So that's, I think, been the adjustment for me. But yeah, definitely now, as it's my full-time job, I can be, like you said, that prolific writer. I can on a daily basis now get these ideas out there and get the good word out. In terms of that
Absolutely.
progressive voice.
Mm. And I think that's really done wonders for I guess the general person's thoughts on these subjects. I mean, we get people like Richard Dawkins like tweeting and pushing through social media some of your articles. I don't know if you actually saw that. I've seen some well-known voices in science community in general pushing
Amazing.
some of your articles out there. So I
That's
mean,
great.
just congratulations and well done for
Thank
that,
you.
right?
Thank you.
So we
Thank
had
you.
you spoke at a conference that we organised as part of Humanity Plus last year, along with Annalie Newitz, which was a Humanity Plus at San Francisco. So there's media material there. I should point out at this stage that I'm organising a conference in Australia a little bit earlier on than the Personhood Beyond the Human conference, and that's in Melbourne, of course. And David Pearce will be talking about some of
Oh,
these subjects
nice.
there. Yeah, so that's going to be
Very
interesting.
nice. Look forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah, yeah, I'll put a link. So I'm particularly interested in these topics. Is it now? I guess have we? Is there anything that we haven't actually covered that you think should be mentioned?
No,
It's
I
been
think
pretty
that's
round.
it. We hit a lot. There's a lot there.
Mm.
A lot of concept there. That's for sure. I hope we didn't risk being too over general, but
Yeah, that's
yeah.
true. But well, I've certainly enjoyed the conversation, George, and
Same.
I
Thank you.
I look forward to having another one in the near future. The links
Absolutely.
to a lot of the articles that we've been discussing are going to be in the description, everybody. So yeah, so I really do appreciate your time, and it's been awesome. So
My
thank you
pleasure.
so much.
Thanks, Adam.
Cheers. We'll speak soon. Okay.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye. All right. I'm just stopping users.